Welcome back to the albums that saved us. This episode, I'm talking about one of my favorite 80s albums, Arcadia's So Red the Rose, which was technically not a Duran Duran album, but in a lot of ways, it was the best album Duran Duran never did. So basically, here's the deal: it was a Duran Duran side project. In 84, Duran Duran was probably the biggest band in the world, 84 to 85. They just had a string of hits, huge MTV band, just come off of the Sing Blue Silver tour, which was the tour for the Seven and the Ragged Tiger album, dominating MTV with hits like The Reflex, I believe their first number one in the US, Union of the Snake, and New Moon on Monday. And just again, huge tour, groundbreaking tour, the first tour to use giant stage projections, giant video stage projection. So all the screaming girls around the world attended these shows, including my wife, who snuck out and snuck up to Oakland when she was about 12 years old to see them, not realizing those shows were filmed for Duran Duran's Arena album. So Duran Duran is the biggest band in the world, biggest album, biggest tour, singles, biggest James Bond theme. First James Bond theme to go to number one, A View to a Kill, Riding High, played Live Aid. Simon Le Bon had a broken note in A View to a Kill. They hadn't gotten together for several months because frankly they were burned out. And by burned out, I mean coked out. There was some of that going on. They were tired of touring. They'd recorded 3 albums in a row, bam, bam, bam. The Seven and the Ragged Tiger album was actually pretty difficult because they had to write it from scratch. The first 2 were already written. So basically they were burned out and they were kind of moving in a more of an electronic direction. So you had kind of a split in the band. You had the bass player, John Taylor, the guitar player, Andy Taylor, who wanted to lean more rockier. And then you had Simon Le Bon and Nick, Simon the singer, Nick the keyboard player, and then Roger the drummer, who wanted to lean more towards that artsy feel. So basically, they decided to take a break. John and Andy wanted to do a covers album with various singers, and the project that they had was called The Power Station. So eventually they wound up getting together with Robert Palmer, who'd come in and recorded a track, and they thought it sounded so great. They got Robert Palmer, Tony Thompson from Chic on drums, Nile Rodgers from Chic to produce, Bernard Edwards from Chic to co-produce. So that was the Power Station, but that's another episode that we will surely do, the other Duran Duran side project. But anyway, back to Arcadia. So Nick, Simon, and Roger wanted to go in a different, more artsier direction. And John and Andy were the rockers. They put together this dark, artsy concept for Arcadia. They ensconced themselves, I believe, at first in Paris, and then, did crazy stuff. And at one time, this was the most expensive album ever produced, Arcadia's So Red the Rose. And they brought in a ton of other musicians to play on this album, including Herbie Hancock, David Gilmour from Pink Floyd, Sting, Grace Jones. And they just had a string of musicians, and they would jam and jam and jam and come up with this super weird, artsy, but more electronic-based stuff. Kind of the direction Duran Duran had been going a little bit with Seven and the Ragged Tiger and maybe even A View to a Kill. And recording time is expensive. The sessions droned on and on. I've read there wasn't a lot of direction, but they would jam and jam and jam and then take these pieces and put it all together. At the time, my Duran Duran friends and I, me and the other girls at high school, were super excited because of these rumors that were coming out. And we were like, oh, is Sting going to join a band with the guys from Duran Duran? Is David Gilmour going to be with the guys from Duran Duran? I worked for the school newspaper, and we wrote up some preview article about Arcadia's So Red the Rose, the new Duran Duran side project. What's it going to be like, et cetera, et cetera. And, again, you've heard this before on albums that saved us, and you'll hear it again. Back in the early 80s, it was difficult to get news and updates. So, we got what we could, frankly, probably snippets from Rolling Stone, snippets from MTV, stuff like that, and, put these pieces together. But stuff would go on and you wouldn't hear much. So you kind of just had to get what you can. So, the interesting thing about this too is they leaned again really artsy, dyed their hair black, wore tuxedos, did this and that. Really artsy videos, really high concept videos. And the singles from the album were Election Day, The Flame, and Goodbye is Forever. At some point, Roger got tired of it. He left the band, Roger Taylor, the drummer. So it was just Simon and Nick. And they went around and they did some TV appearances that they lip synced. And it was rumored at one point they were going to do some shows, but they didn't wind up doing that. They did a song called Say the Word, which was in some movie. I don't remember what, but that's a good song. Should have been on the album. It was on later releases of the album, like reissues and all that. Very cool album, released in 85. Just a real kind of testament to how artsy these guys could be. A lot of new wave influences and just, again, very atmospheric. And so it opens with Election Day. I remember getting the 12-inch for that with many different versions. Very cool song. Wild kind of look to the day. A decent hit for them, but they were kind of sliding, I think, from their Duran Duran heights, and maybe the listening world was tired of them. I was getting older. The other girls were getting older, so maybe we were getting a little burned out on Duran Duran. Election Day's really one of the standout tracks. A very heavy bass, very atmospheric synthesizers and drums, and very intricate percussion as well. And then next up, you got another good song, Keeping Me in the Dark, very electronic textured, a lot of great instrumentation. Then comes The Flame, which is a kind of a heavier song, heavy drums, got some piano in there, coupled up with some synthesizers as well. Then a couple from there, The Promise, El Diablo, a little more brooding tracks. El Diablo's got a bit of a, because it's Spanish for the devil, El Diablo. So it's got those Latin influences and kind of stands out a little bit from the album. Overall, it's a pretty consistent album. The sound's pretty consistent. Say the Word stands out a little bit, but it was different. I think it should have been on the album. At the time, the album So Red the Rose was very experimental, very sonic sounding, a lot of new musical territory for the band. And I think they tried a lot of new things in the studio. Simon Le Bon's vocals, very introspective and uplifting. And I guess, you could say they were still a little overshadowed by Duran Duran. And maybe both the side projects were trying to get out of the shadow of Duran Duran, to tell the truth. Again, this is a great album. I think it's a must listen if you're a Duran Duran fan, especially if you're not familiar with it. A lot of Duran Duran fans prefer it to the Power Station. I think it's just kind of apples and oranges, because the Power Station is more rockier, is more funkier, is heavier. Very, very heavy drums from Tony Thompson. And then So Red the Rose, again, more atmospheric, more artsy, more synthy, and a little more of that Nick Rhodes influence, I would say. I think he heavily influenced this project. But again, in my opinion, this is the best album Duran Duran never did. And I think it was a direction they were moving in. Roger left the band. Andy left the band. They started recording the Notorious album, which is kind of their, you would call almost like a Blue-Eyed Soul type of thing, produced by Nile Rodgers. But by then, Duran Duran was Simon Le Bon, the singer, Nick Rhodes, the keyboard player, and then John Taylor, the bass player, with session musicians. Andy Taylor played a little bit on that album. But from there, they kind of were fractured for a while. At some point, they got back together, the whole band, but that's a whole different story. If you're not familiar with So Red the Rose, if you like 80s music, it's one of my top, not top, but it's one of my top 80s albums, high up there on the list. And again, a great, interesting Duran Duran side project. and a great musical experiment. And, even if just for the guest musicians they had on there, again, people like Grace Jones, Herbie Hancock, Sting, David Gilmour, and other musicians. A lot of musicians played on this, and very, very experimental. Arcadia's So Red the Rose, in parentheses, Duran Duran side project.